What if I told you the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't actually write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? The four Gospels we consider foundational to Christianity were originally anonymous documents, no author names, no apostolic stamps of approval. They circulated for decades before anyone attached names to them, and those names became the reason they're in your Bible today. So how did four anonymous texts beat out dozens of competitors to become the Gospels? To understand how these four won, we need to start at the beginning, or rather, 40 years after the beginning. Jesus died around 30 CE. Mark, the earliest Gospel, wasn't written until around 70 CE. That's 40 years of oral tradition, scattered writings, and competing memories. Mark came first, then Matthew and Luke came later, and they used Mark as a source. Scholars call this the synoptic problem, the puzzle of tracing who copied whom among these three similar Gospels. Here's the evidence. Luke's prologue, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, explicitly describes his research methodology. He consulted sources, he investigated, he compiled an orderly account. This isn't divine revelation, this is investigative journalism. Luke tells us he's doing research, not receiving visions. John came last, around 90 to 100 CE, with a distinctly different approach. By 150 CE, the landscape looked very different from today. Multiple Gospels circulated across early Christian communities: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, but also Thomas, Judas, Mary, Peter, and others. Justin Martyr, writing around this time, references memoirs of the apostles, plural and vague. He doesn't specify which ones. The four we know weren't obviously special yet. They were part of a crowded field. There are different communities favor different texts. Some use Gospels we've never heard of. The question hanging over second century Christianity, which Gospels should we trust? Then, Sam? So by the mid-second century, Christians had a problem, too many Gospels, and four main ones that didn't always agree. What do you do when your sacred texts contradict each other? Two solutions emerged. First, Tatian's diatessaron. Around 170 CE, Tatian took all four Gospels and wove them into one harmonized narrative. The mashup approach, eliminate contradictions by merging everything together. Second, apostolic attribution. Keep all four separate, but justify them by claiming each one connected to an apostle or eyewitness. Authority through association. The attribution strategy worked like this. Mark supposedly recorded Peter's preaching in Rome. Peter was an eyewitness, so Mark carries eyewitness authority. Luke supposedly recorded Paul's gospel. Paul was an apostle, so Luke carries apostolic authority. Matthew was attributed directly to the disciple Matthew, eyewitness himself. John was attributed to the disciple John, another eyewitness. See the pattern? Each gospel gets linked to someone who was there, or someone who knew someone who was there. The message? This isn't just some guy's account. This is Peter's eyewitness testimony, filtered through Mark. But here's the problem with these traditional attributions. Consider Papias, an early church father writing around 130 CE. He claimed Matthew was originally written in Hebrew and later translated to Greek. This is demonstrably false. The Greek text of Matthew shows no signs of translation from Hebrew. Scholars can identify translation artifacts in texts, word order patterns, idioms that don't quite work. Matthew's Greek reads like original Greek composition, not translation. If Papias got this basic fact wrong about Matthew, what does that suggest about the reliability of other traditional attributions? These claims came decades after the texts circulated. We need to distinguish two terms. Anonymous means published without any name attached. Pseudonymous means published under a false name from the start, someone deliberately claiming to be Paul or Peter when they weren't. The Gospels were anonymous. They circulated without author names for decades. The names came later, added by communities seeking to establish authority. This matters because the Gospels weren't trying to deceive anyone about authorship. They simply didn't claim authorship at all. The attributions were external additions, not original features. Tatian's diatessaron, remember the harmonized mashup, was eventually rejected. The church chose to keep 4 separate gospels with their tensions intact, rather than one smooth narrative. This decision shaped Christianity. 4 perspectives, 4 theological emphases, 4 portraits of Jesus that don't always align. The church decided that diversity of witness mattered more than narrative consistency. The apostolic attribution strategy won. By the late 2nd century, these 4, and only these 4, were considered authoritative precisely because they were believed to connect to eyewitnesses or apostles. So what does all this mean for us today? This isn't about undermining faith. It's about understanding how these texts actually came to us. When you read the Gospels, you're reading documents that early Christians chose to preserve because they found them meaningful. The selection process reveals what early Christians valued: apostolic connection, perceived reliability, theological consistency with emerging orthodoxy. The 4 Gospels didn't become authoritative because we know who wrote them. They became authoritative because early Christians believed they knew who wrote them, and that belief shaped the Bible you can read today. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John aren't historical facts. They're theological claims about authority and the trustworthiness. Here's your practical takeaway. Read Luke's prologue yourself, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Notice how the author describes his own methodology. He mentions many who have undertaken to compile accounts. He describes investigating everything carefully from the beginning. He's transparent about his process, and this is a window into how early Christians actually produced these texts, not divine dictation, human research, compilation, and the theological reflection on traditions they received. The 4 Gospels became the 4 Gospels through a historical process. Anonymous texts gained attributed names. Attributed names conveyed authority. Authority determined which texts survived and which faded into obscurity. Understanding this process doesn't diminish these texts. It reveals them as products of communities who found them worth preserving, copying, and defending. Communities whose choices shape how billions encounter the story of Jesus.